Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Renee. I appreciate that. And it's good to have the opportunity to be here with you folks. Like Renee said, don't be afraid to ask questions. You can type them in the chat box as well if you've got a question or a comment or a thought there. I do have a list of questions that were submitted ahead of time, so I think I'll just kind of go through those, and then we'll hopefully have some additional questions at the end. I will say there's some really good questions submitted. Some of them could have an entire webinar dedicated to each question just itself, because there's just a lot of details that go into some of these. So I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail as what we might like. I'll try to give some initial thoughts, comments, responses, but feel free to follow up with a follow-up question if I don't answer it completely enough. So Renee, you can see the first question here. Just want to double check we got the right screen up.
Yes, looks great.
Okay. All right. So the first question that we're going to deal with, I planted rye for the first time this fall. When and how should I terminate it? Now, this is a great question because, planting the cover crop is important, getting it up, getting it growing. That's all great. But if you don't get it terminated properly and at the right time, then your cover crop experience is still not going to be a great one. And it can actually hurt you in the long run if you don't get the termination part right. And so when should you terminate it and how should you terminate it are based on a lot of different things. It depends on your goals. It depends on the weather. Are you doing corn next, beans next, alleliopathy? So I'm going to talk about each one of these just kind of briefly. But again, this is one that we could spend an entire webinar talking about. But as far as the when should you terminate it, your goals have to come into play here. If your goal is to produce as much biomass as you can for weed suppression as deep into the summer as you can get, then you need to terminate that really close to planting of the next crop. And it's going to be a little different for corn versus beans. But if that weed control aspect, especially the summer weed control, is not a big deal for you, then you can terminate that a little bit earlier, especially if you're nervous about some nutrient tie-up and things like that with your corn. So the timing, there's nothing magical about the timing. It just really depends on what your goals there are. I will say that, it's much easier to let that cereal rye grow longer into the spring if you're following it with soybeans. And the reason is that the cereal rye is just a great scavenger of nitrogen. It's going to have almost all the nitrogen that is in your soil, the free nitrogen in your soil. It's going to have it tied up in that cereal rye plant material. And that's a really good thing ahead of soybeans. You don't want excess nitrogen in the soil for your soybeans. Number one, it can get away from you if it leaches away or you have runoff. But number two, it makes those soybeans lazy if they can access free nitrogen in the soil. They're not going to be incentivized as much to nodulate. And so having that nitrogen tied up ahead of soybeans is a great thing. Having all that nitrogen tied up ahead of your corn is much more challenging because you can get a lot of yellow corn syndrome with it following cereal rye. And so again, it doesn't mean you can't let the rye grow later. And that's the point with alleliopathy versus nutrient tie-up. A lot of people will see yellow corn after rye and they'll say, well, that's an alleliopathic effect of that cereal rye. And that's not really true. True alleliopathy will prevent something from actually germinating or growing. And that's not what you see with yellow corn. A true alleliopathy is a chemical reaction or a chemical response where it's chemically suppressing the germination of weed seeds or other things out there. And that's, you almost rarely see that with corn coming into cereal rye, regardless of how big that rye is. But what you do see quite often is when the corn kind of turns yellow, and that's just simply a nitrogen, mostly nitrogen. Sometimes it can be sulfur or other nutrients, but mostly nitrogen is tied up in that cereal rye, and the corn is just starved for nitrogen early on. Now, all of that nitrogen that is tied up in that cereal rye, it will come available eventually, but the bigger the rye is, the longer it takes for that to decompose and break down and cycle back to the crop. And if it's fairly mature rye, that might be late July, early August before that happens. which again, with soybeans, that's the perfect time. You want, 15, 20 pounds of extra nitrogen coming available for beans late in the season like that. But with corn, that's just way too late. So if you're going to have rye and plant corn into it, and your rye has any kind of growth or size to it, then you really have to have a good nitrogen strategy. And I think there maybe is even a question later on about how much nitrogen do you need for that. So we can talk about that a little bit later. If that's a concern, and if it's your first time doing it and you're planting corn into cereal rye, I would err on the side of terminating earlier. And when I say earlier, it's probably going to be 10 to 14 days before you plant your corn. Now, I can say that because we're here in Nebraska and we almost never have wet springs. Where you guys are at there in Indiana, terminating early can be an issue because as long as that cover crop is growing, it's pulling moisture out of the soil. It helps you get in and get your crops planted. And that's why you guys plant green far more often than what we might do here, because you need to use up that moisture. We're trying to save it and conserve it and preserve it. And so that would be one thing that you'd have to worry about, is if you terminated it early and that rye starts to die and decompose, it's no longer using moisture, but it's doing a really good job of holding moisture into the soil. You could have planting issues there. So that would be something that would have to be considered with that. So the timing is going to be a really big thing that is just going to vary depending on what your goals are, and if it's corn versus soybeans. If I'm doing beans, I'm letting that rye grow until I get my beans planted, and then I'm going to terminate the rye. With corn, if I do that, I'm going to have to be really careful about my nitrogen cycling through the system. As far as how you do it, there's going to be two main ways. One is going to be chemicals, and that's going to be what most people are going to do. Unless you're organic, then you're probably going to be looking at a roller crimper. And the roller crimper can be effective, but only within a very specific window of opportunity for that rye. It's going to be at anthesis, which is when that rye plant is flowering, it's shedding pollen, so it's already headed out and there's pollen being shed, and then it's pretty susceptible to being killed with the roller crimper. Again, that may make it too late for what you're comfortable with for planting. So if you have the chemical option, plant your crop, and then you go out there and you kill the rye. Cereal rye can still be killed relatively easily with glyphosate. It's one of the few things that glyphosate still controls pretty well by itself. But you likely are going to use whatever you would normally use for your burn down, for your pre's, for your residual chemicals that you want out there anyway. So, if you're roller crimping, then you got to wait for that specific time frame. Now, there are some people, organic folks that are organic mostly, they're planting their soybeans into that cereal rye when the rye is at the boot stage. And then they're coming back when the rye is at anthesis, which is usually 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes as much as 4 weeks later. And they're actually roller crimping it after the soybeans are up and emerged. And if you're interested in that, I can get you some good information about people that are doing that successfully, and some strategies around doing that. So it gives you the opportunity to get your beans planted earlier, but still let your rye grow and accumulate biomass. I've got some slides later on that will show how much additional biomass you can accumulate if you're willing to wait and not terminate that early. So great question on the termination. Again, there's just so many variables. You're really going to want to think through the timing of the termination is going to be much trickier, most likely, than how you're going to do it. Okay, so the next question kind of follows with that, and I alluded to this one a little bit ago. This is my first year planting corn, green into standing cereal rye, and vetch. How much nitrogen do I need to apply with the planter to get the corn started? So I put this one here because it really follows nicely with that first one, as far as, I already talked about how cereal rye is so good at tying up and holding on to the nitrogen. So we have to put nitrogen on either at planting or shortly thereafter to kind of get that corn up and going. And so this question fits into that nicely. How much nitrogen do I need to put on with the planter to get the corn started? Again, there's going to be a lot of variables here. The question said standing rye and vetch. So, some of this is going to be determined on how much rye versus how much vetch. Because if it's all vetch, there may be 200 pounds of nitrogen out there in the cover crop biomass, and it could come available pretty quickly. If it's mostly rye and just a little bit of vetch, then there might only be, 70 pounds of nitrogen, and it may not cycle out of there, until, July and August. So the first thing that you'd want to do in kind of looking at this is you'd kind of want to know how fast will that residue break down. The best way to test that is when you terminate your cover crop, take a clipping of that, just take a square yard clipping or a couple square feet, whatever that is, clip that, send it into a lab and just have them test it for nitrogen and for carbon. And then they'll be able to tell you what the carbon nitrogen ratio is. And the lower that number is, say if the carbon nitrogen ratio is 20, that means there's 20 parts of carbon for every 1 part of nitrogen. If it's 30, then there's more carbon and less nitrogen. And if it's 10, there's, the ratio is comparing the nitrogen and the carbon. That's going to be a good indication of how fast that's going to cycle and how fast that nitrogen comes back to your following crop. Ideally, if you want to get most of that cycling out in within the first 60 days of termination of that cover crop, then you're going to want that number in the low 20s and under. If that number comes back and it's 25, 30, 35, mature cereal rye, for example, is going to be 60. And that just means it's going to break down really slowly and you're not going to get much nitrogen out of that very quickly. But if it's like say 15 or 20, it's going to cycle out pretty quickly. So with that being said, let's just say this is kind of an average cereal rye vetch combination mix, I would put on as much nitrogen in the furrow as what I could without harming the germination of my crop. And that's going to depend on the form of nitrogen that you're using. So you'd want to just work with your fertility guy on how much you could put. If you're doing 1034-0, you probably can't do a whole lot more than, maybe 6-7 gallons of the 1034-0 starter right in the furrow, or you'll start burning that seed with some of that high salt fertilizer. But if you can do like a 2x2 and get some nitrogen off to the side, then, I think 30 or 40 pounds off to the side is enough to kind of get that crop up and going and get a good start to it. And then, how much additional you put on, whether it's through side dressing or if you're irrigated, you can put it on through the pivot, or you may, just stream bar it on. That's kind of, again, up to the equipment that you have and the timing that you're going to be working under there. But if you're going to let your rye grow, you just can't have very much of your nitrogen out there ahead of time, or it's all going to be tied up in the cereal rye. And so 30 to 40 pounds, if you can get that on with planter, would be great. And then put the balance on sometime pre-tassel. Corn is going to need probably half its nitrogen up to the tassel and then the other half after that. So you're going to want to make sure that you're not shorting yourself early on there. So again, there's lots of different ways to accomplish that and to work with that. I do have a couple slides later that I'll show you some nitrogen contribution from cover crops, and I'll talk about that concept a little bit more here too. Well, I guess it's this one here. So this question is, what are the best crops for nitrogen fixation? Best cover crops for nitrogen fixation. Obviously it's going to be legumes, and there's a lot of different types of legumes. If you're doing, there's a question later about what's the best cover crop after wheat. If you're doing wheat or anything else that's harvested in the summertime, you've got a lot of choices. There's cowpeas and sun hemp and soybeans and mung beans. There's lots of choices if you're planting this cover crop in July, August type time frame. If you're coming in later after a corn or soybean crop or silage or something like this, where you're not getting it planted till mid-September, October, then your choices get a lot more limited because obviously those warm season things like a cowpea are going to die with the first frost. That's not going to be worth the money if it only grows for a few weeks. So now you're looking at things that can survive cold weather. So you're looking at probably hairy vetch is going to be the number one most widely used cold hardy legume to produce nitrogen. Winter peas would be another option. They're a little bit more difficult because they need to be planted deeper in order to overwinter. But the biggest thing is you can select the right species and you can get the right seeding rate. You can get all these things right. But if you're not willing to let it grow in the spring in order to produce that nitrogen that you're counting on, I tell people don't spend very much money on legume cover crops unless you've got enough patience to let it grow into the spring. And let me show you what I mean here. So this is some work that we did. We've done this for the last couple of years. This happens to be data from just this past spring. So this was all cover crops that were planted in around the first week in October in 2021. So we harvested soybeans. We came in and we planted these plots, and you can see we had a couple different combinations of rye, vetch, rye and peas. We had monoculture barley, triticale, different seeding rates of rye, and then we had just some straight hairy vetch as well. So we planted all these different things out there, and then we came out and we started doing the biomass samples, or we took the clippings, like I was telling you, one yard square clippings. And then we sent them into the lab to be analyzed. We started May 5th, and then we did it every week thereafter for 5 weeks. So the 5th, the 12th, the 20th, 26th, and then June 2nd. And this chart here shows the amount of biomass accumulation from these plots. And so the blue bar is what we measured May 5th. So if you look at the first one, and this is a mix of 30 pounds of rye and 15 pounds of vetch. You know, that first week when we sampled it, it was just under a ton. And this is dry matter basis. So we sent it into the lab. They cook all the water out of it and then weigh what's left just to see how much it actually was. So less than 1 ton, you know, you go forward a week and it, you know, was up to about 1 1/3 tons. And I don't know what the weather was like there in Indiana, but we had a really cold snap about that middle of May, and you'll see almost all of these. I got almost no growth that second week of May, and some springs are like that. Other times we just see a big shoot up of biomass, but very little accumulation in that week because it was cold. In fact, we had some crops freeze. We had some corn that got burnt back with frost. Warmed up again between May 20th and May 26th there. It really jumped up. And so, that one we're seeing almost 2.5 tons. But then look at how much in 1 week's time between May 26th and June 2nd, it went from about 2.5 tons to over 4 tons of biomass in that 1 week. And that just shows you, if you're willing to wait, you're going to get tremendous amount of growth on that tail end of that season. And it's all about heat units. It's all about heat units. If we would have had a much warmer spring, these charts would have definitely been shifted, and I would have had that 4 tons, probably by May 20th. And some years are going to be like that, and some years are going to be like this, where we don't see that until June 2nd. If you look kind of towards the middle there, the 80 pounds of Elbon rye, definitely more biomass early on. So if you look at that, by May 5th, that Elbon had over 2 tons of biomass. Because I only had 30 pounds of rye in this mix, the vetch wasn't hardly contributing anything early on. But by the end, the mix actually had more biomass than just the straight rye, which is kind of exciting. If you look clear over to the right, the AU Merit hairy vetch and the Oregon, well, the AU Merit, I guess, is the one that we tested. We didn't even pull a sample on this May 5th because there wasn't anything out there to sample. There wasn't enough to physically clip and send into the lab, because vetch is just a little slower getting going. By the 12th, we had accumulated about 800 pounds, didn't get much that next week, had a decent amount of growth that we measured May 26th. But then, the big jump again came that last week of May. And so as we give it more time to grow, we get more benefits. And then here's what the nitrogen pounds per acre looks like. And this is what's really interesting and is kind of exciting. So again, the same crops, the same testing cadence here, starting the first week in May and going through the first week of June. You see the nitrogen accumulation here with the rye and the vetch. And again, look at the amount of nitrogen, you can tell this is where the vetch kicked in, that between May 20th and May 26th, the vetch finally started growing. And we went from about 60 pounds of nitrogen to about 130. So it doubled the amount of nitrogen in that week. I'm not exactly sure why it came back down that next week. It's probably because the rye really took off and kind of started smothering the vetch out. But we didn't get the majority of our nitrogen production until it warmed up. And then again, if you look at the AU Merit hairy vetch, I had about 70 pounds of nitrogen May 12th. Really didn't do anything that next week. It almost doubled. It went to about 160 by May 26th. And then by the time we roll around to the first week of June, we're up to almost 200 pounds. So you just have to be patient if you're going to put these legumes out there. Can you grow 200 pounds of nitrogen for a corn crop? Yes, you can if you're willing, if you're patient and willing to wait. And you're not going to get all this. It's going to take time to cycle. I was telling you about the carbon nitrogen ratio. So the 30 pounds of rye and 15 pounds of vetch, the C to N ratio of that is probably going to be around that 20 to 22 to 1. So it'll cycle out, but it'll take a little bit of time. The hairy vetch by itself is about 14 to 15 carbon nitrogen ratio. And so it's going to cycle pretty quickly. These samples where it was rye by itself, it was up over 30 to 1. So again, the nitrogen that's in here, and and it's still showing that even with where I didn't have any legumes, my soil is healthy enough. It's releasing about 60 pounds of nitrogen just with cereal rye, but I'm not going to get that back for my next crop until later in the season because it's just straight rye. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feeling for, the legumes, what you can use ahead of corn and what you can expect. I will talk a little bit more later on. There's another question about cover crops after wheat. We'll talk more about what does it look like if I do a summer cover crop and what can I expect there. All right, what is the return on investment of cover crops ahead of corn and beans? And can I reduce inputs and other costs? Again, this is a great question. It's super broad, and we could go a lot of different ways and directions with that. And can I reduce inputs and other costs? Yes, if depending on the rest of the system, just simply by having a cover crop out there and doing nothing else, I would be pretty hesitant about reducing my inputs too much too quickly, especially if it's your first year. One thing that we see with cover crops and really with the majority of these soil health and regenerative practices is they are a bit of a compounding and cascading effect. And what that means is that I'll get some benefits the first year, but I'll get more benefits as I continue to do it. And that's because, like even from the nitrogen cycling standpoint, I might get 50% of my nitrogen cycling out the first season, but I'll get another 25% of that the next year and the next year and so forth and so on. And so these benefits, I don't realize them all in the first year, but I will have some residual benefits that build up. And that has to do with the nutrient cycling. It has to do with soil aggregation, your infiltration, your weed suppression. All of these things will get better as the longer that you do it. And so the first year, I would not plan on reducing my inputs and other costs a lot. You can't take that risk. Now, I would have a significant reduction. I would cut my fertility by 50% on one strip through the field, so I could see what that did. I don't know that I would do it to a much bigger strip than that. And then as I move forward and I do this year after year, I might have a strip where I reduce it by 50% and maybe one where I reduce it by 70%. With the application equipment that most people have these days, it's relatively easy now to do those nitrogen check strips and to have a GPS reference so you can see it from your yield monitor, because you really don't know what the effect of reducing those inputs is going to be unless you leave some check strips and unless you're just really diligent about seeing, well, what did that do? And so that's my recommendation, is that you don't cut back very much on the whole field, but you do cut back significantly on a strip that you can monitor and test. And then based on what you see and what you learn there, that's how aggressive and how much you start doing then the next years. I wanted to just show you a little bit of data here, not necessarily, this doesn't really have anything to do with the input reduction so much as more of a return on investment. I think that this was done by SARE, Sustainable Ag Research and Education, along with a group of other people that helped them put this together. They do a national cover crop survey, and I think they've done about 6 of them now. And they ask all kinds of questions, and the data is all online. Just if you just search for National Cover Crop Survey, this will pop up pretty easily. But one of the things that they always ask is, what did your corn yield where you had cover crops before the corn, and what did it yield where you didn't have cover crops before the corn? And then they ask the same question with soybeans. And so, when it comes to a return on investment, this is a pretty good indication. Yield is, a return on investment. And this is assuming that all the other things are similar. They didn't really account for any reduction of inputs or anything like that. Just simply looking at yield here. And so this is the latest survey, 2019. The average yield of the people that responded to the survey for corn, 181.7, where they had cover crops, and 178.2 where they didn't. So, 3.5 bushels of corn per acre increase where they used cover crops versus where they didn't. Is that significant? Well, it's a little bit, but I don't know that you could say it's statistically super significant. So was there enough return on investment there to pay for your cover crop seed? No, but it certainly is going to help. And I think when done properly, most guys will tell you that, the cover crops are not hurting their yield on corn. We see a much greater increase in soybeans, and a lot of it has to do with what I talked about earlier with just the function of nutrient cycling and tying up that nitrogen and releasing it to the beans late in the season. 54.4 average soybean yield where they use cover crops, 51.8 where they did not. So from a percentage or statistically significant, this is more statistically significant. Beans are more valuable, and so here we definitely see enough of a return on investment to have definitely paid for the seed. But here's what's interesting. The first year that they did the survey was 2012. And I know that you guys out there were very dry, just like the rest of us in 2012. And the conventional thinking would be, oh man, that should have been the worst year to do this survey, because the moisture that those cover crops used certainly had to have hurt both the corn and the soybean yields. But it's not the case. In fact, ever since they started doing this, the biggest benefit to cover crops they've ever seen has been in one of the driest years on record. Very, very interesting, just particularly with corn. And so 2012, obviously corn yields across the board were significantly less, 126.2, where people had cover crops ahead of the corn crop, 115, so 9 bushels difference. That is statistically significant. That's a pretty big deal. And it's simply because those guys that were using cover crops, their soils were enough healthier. They had better infiltration when they did get rain. They had less evaporation. And so that the moisture used by the cover crops did not end up hurting them on a yield standpoint. And again, on the beans, there was about a 5 bushel increase there as well. Beans are much more consistent in that yield bump that we see. Corn will vary more. But I just wanted to show you that to get you thinking about the fact that, some of the return on investment is going to come from better yields. Some of it is going to come from reduced inputs. And certainly, the numbers that I showed with, if you can produce, 200 pounds of nitrogen, and even if you only get 50% of that made available for your next crop, well, that's 100 pounds of nitrogen. That's worth a lot of money right now. And even if that number is only 50, that's still a significant reduction of inputs that you're going to be able to do down the road if you can produce that nitrogen through the cover crop. Lots of people will report reduction of herbicides, even though you may need to use a herbicide to terminate your cover crop. The amount of weed control that you get from that biomass that you grew really helps reduce the amount of herbicide that you need later in the season. And especially, again, as you do it multiple years in a row, you see it get better and better and better. So, so the question on can I reduce inputs and other costs? Yes, just be cautious about doing too much too soon. Make sure you do those test strips and work together with other people in your area to do additional test strips as well. Share that information and let other people know what's happening there. And then that return on investment, the national surveys are showing that, yes, there is a good return on investment for the cover crop seed. And that's kind of a summary of what's there. Rick Clark, who farms in your area. Now, I know Rick farms differently than most of us. He's, essentially no-till and organic, which, most of us are not. That's not our goal. But Rick's got some really good economics of soil health numbers, and these are freely available on YouTube. So if you really want to take a deeper dive into some of this return on investments, obviously he's reduced inputs to where he's no longer using fertility and herbicides and things like that. But you can definitely see, and even if you're not going to try to get to the point where he's at, there's still a lot you can learn from how much could I reduce things in my system. And so I would encourage you to go and check out this seminar that Rick has out there on YouTube. Okay, what is a good cover crop mix after wheat? How does it compare to double crop soybeans? I love this question. I love this one because the best time to plant a cover crop, in my opinion, is July and August. Particularly, towards the end of July, first part of August, we can still use our warm season things, which, like cowpeas and sun hemp and sorghums and millets, things like this that your soils probably almost never see. But we can also put the cool season things in. I can have some radishes in there. I can have some turnips in there. I can have different things. So we have the ability to really have the maximum amount of diversity in that time frame, and that matches up really well for coming in after wheat. So what's the best cover crop mix to plant? Well, that really depends on what your goals are. If you're trying to feed livestock, that's going to be a little bit different mix. If you're trying to suppress weeds, that's going to be a little different mix. If you're trying to max out how much nitrogen you can fix, again, that's going to be a little bit different type of a mix. It may have a lot of the same species in it, but the percentages and the ratios of those species in the mix could vary quite a bit based on what your goals are. We have, take sun hemp, for example. Sun hemp is a tropical legume. It's only going to grow with really warm temperatures. And so you can really only plant that June, July, maybe the first part of August. But, we've seen sun hemp get 6 feet tall and produce 150, 160 pounds of nitrogen in 60 days. But only if you're getting it planted right away after wheat to take advantage of all those heat units that you have during that time frame. Cowpeas can do some similar things. There's just a lot of benefits that can happen after wheat. How does it compare to double crop beans? Well, again, that's a great question. It will compare really good to 15 to 20 bushel beans. It may not compare as well if you're growing 40 to 45 bushel double crop beans. And again, you're not going to know what kind of beans you're going to grow, until the season kind of happens. We don't typically have enough growing season here in Nebraska, growing season or moisture, to double crop beans after wheat. So I'm not as familiar with this concept as, some of the customers that we work with. But I do know this, and many of you know Dave Brandt. You've probably heard some of his talks. I know that Dave no longer plants any double crop beans. He calls them greedy beans because he thinks that trying to get that second cash crop is showing that you're maybe a little bit greedy in trying to extract as much as you can from the soil, because Dave likes to use that window of opportunity after he harvests wheat to set himself up to grow a really good corn crop. So he's growing these big multi-species, diverse mixes, growing all this nitrogen, growing all this weed control, all this biomass to suppress weeds. And so he doesn't get income off the beans, but he also uses very few inputs to grow a really good corn crop the next year. So if he can save a couple $100 in inputs for the corn crop the next year, he's essentially offsetting the lost income for what he could have got with the double crop beans. So again, it's hard to give a definitive answer. My suggestion to you would be, if you've got a 100-acre wheat field and you've never done this before, I would plant 50 acres to a cover crop, and I would plant 50 acres to double crop beans. And then I would plant corn on that whole field the next year, and let the corn tell you. You won't know the financial numbers until that next crop, so you can see how things performed after that. But if you don't try at least some cover crop, you'll never know, and you'll be asking the same questions again next year that you're asking this year. So if you've got that opportunity, I wouldn't necessarily do the entire farm if you're not comfortable with it, but I also would make sure I did something so that I could learn as I went. And again, if there's a nice group of people on the call here. If there's multiple people doing this, there's 3 or 4 people that have wheat and they're interested in trying something like this. Try 3 or 4 different mixes, and then go and tour each other's farms and learn from each other, so that you have the ability to see multiple mixes, even though you only had to purchase and plant one of them. Excuse me. Okay, how do recommendations for cover crops differ with no-till versus strip-till? Again, we don't have a lot of strip-till here in our area, and I don't know that I would do a lot of cover crop. I don't know that I'd have a lot of different recommendation for the strip-till, but a lot of it would depend on when you're doing your strip tilling, whether you're doing fall strip till or spring strip till. I would need a lot more information before I would do that. Now, I will say that we have people who are doing strip till, and they're modifying their cover crop seeding equipment to where that strip is going to go, and they're typically doing spring strip tilling. Where that strip is going to go, they're not planting anything in that strip that's going to overwinter. So when they come in and they build their strip, there's no cover crop there for them to have to destroy or to take out or to cause issues with the equipment. So they're essentially leaving a blank strip, or they'll plant something like radishes or maybe some peas or something that isn't going to overwinter. So you'll get a little bit of fall growth, but then where that strip is, that's all winter killed, and then they can easily strip till. But in between, they still got their cereal rye, they still got the hairy vetch, the overwintering crops are still growing and building up those benefits to the soil and the biology. So that's the ideal situation if you have the equipment to be able to specifically seed a cover crop mix for strip tilling. I would definitely modify it that way and not have overwintering crops in that strip. Best crops for grazing. Again, highly dependent upon many factors, mostly timing. Are we spring planting this? Are we summer planting this? Are we fall planting it going into the spring? For the most part, most of these cover crops are going to be pretty good for grazing. There's going to be some that are better than others, and a lot of that's just simply going to have to do with digestibility and the nutrient quality of it. And so there are some, particularly in the summertime, if you're planting sorghums, you can go with brown midrib sorghums that have less lignin and higher amounts of digestible nutrients. You certainly would use those for grazing. We know that within the brassica family, turnips and collards are going to be more palatable than radish and rapeseed. So there's certain things like that where if you go to Renee or whoever there at Pence and say, well, I want to plant this and I want to graze it, there's some certain choices there that we can help them make that are definitely going to make it better grazing. But there's most of these things are going to be okay for grazing, and sometimes we'll actually put things in a grazing mix that aren't very palatable, simply because we want something left there after the cattle leave, because we still need to feed our microbes. We still want to have our soil covered. And so sometimes when it's the farmer and it's the cowboy competing with each other, and oftentimes it's within the same person, the cowboy a lot of times wins and all of the biomass gets removed by the animals. We actually can see your soil health go backwards when doing that. So you want to make sure you leave enough biomass out there for the soil, for your microbes. And so keep that in mind as you're designing these grazing mixes as well. There was a question about herbicide selection. I put it in here, but I'm really not sure exactly what the question means. I don't know if this is herbicides to terminate the different species or what herbicides to use the year before and still be able to plant the certain cover crop species. And you know, again, we're not chemical experts. We can't really make chemical recommendations. There's some good resources out there. I can share some of the resources that we use with Renee to have her help, you know, share that with you. There's some good research done by the University of Missouri. University of Wisconsin has done some, and it's mostly looking at common corn and soybean herbicides that would be used in the spring, and what effect does that have on fall planted cover crop species. That's probably what the question means, but again, I'm not 100% sure. But there's some good resources out there that we can share on that. Interseeding into corn, specifically in 60-inch rows, interseeding has become much more popular as people have seen some successes, particularly when it's difficult to get anything planted in the fall. The thought is if we can get something going in the summertime and then have it still out there growing when we harvest our corn, well, that's a great situation. We've done a lot of good benefits to our soil, and we're not so dependent upon the fall weather and fall labor situation. Problem is when we interseed this into corn in 30-inch rows, there's usually not enough sunlight to really give us much cover crop growth. And so some people have been looking at 60-inch row corn and then putting the cover crops in between those rows and having much greater success. And so again, you know, very rich topic that we could spend a lot of time on. We've got a whole webinar on our YouTube channel that I would encourage you to, if you want to take a deeper dive into that. It's an hour-long video just talking about corn interseeding. A lot of that is going to be talking about 30-inch rows, but some of it will be talking about 60-inch rows as well. And then there's other things out here, like this is Lance Klessig, a friend of ours from Minnesota. He did a little short video. He did some experiments of 60-inch corn versus 30-inch, and he's just showing you the difference between the success that he had. And in fact, I don't know if you got, this is one of our soil health resource guides from a couple years ago. This is actually Lance's picture. It's probably from that field right there. Such a great picture. He got so much growth in that 60-inch row that it was just really impressive. So the answer is you'll get lots more cover crop growth in a 60-inch row of corn, but you may give up some corn yield in order to do it. Practical Farmers of Iowa, PFI, has done a lot of research in this, comparing 30-inch corn versus 60-inch corn, how the guys are doing it, how they're seeding the corn, how they're putting their cover crops in. And they do a really good job collecting the data, documenting, any yield changes that they see out there. You know, most guys aren't seeing a lot of yield drag, maybe 5%. But there's been some guys that have figured it out to where they don't have a yield drag because of how they're planting their corn. So again, there's good resources out there. These are just a couple of them that I would encourage you to go investigate. I would not recommend that you do this on a large scale to begin with, especially in 60-inch rows, because you really need to make sure you have your equipment set up right to do it. And it's not worth making a big equipment investment unless you kind of prove to yourself that it's a concept that's going to be worth you doing on a large scale. So again, experiment, get together with some other people and different people try different things. We are going to be doing a much greater emphasis on interseeding into corn for our summer field day here in Bladen. I know Renee and some of the folks came out last year. Maybe you can get a busload coming out this way next year, Renee, and And we'll be doing it both in 30-inch rows and 60-inch rows, and looking at a number of different factors, because it's a really hot topic right now. There's a lot of interest in it, but it's a difficult one to achieve good success with because of the lack of sunlight underneath the corn. I think this might be the last one I have written down here. There's been a lot of talk about micronutrients, which are good ones, which ones are snake oil, how do you use, and what are the application rates? And again, I'm not sure if the person that asked this is really talking about micronutrients, like zinc and boron and manganese, or if they're talking more about biological additives, compost extracts, different types of bacteria that you can put in the soil. So I'm not 100% sure on that. Regardless, I guess my thoughts on this would be pretty similar, but particularly this would be my thoughts and opinions towards the biological products. I think that all of the biological products that we've looked at, I've seen them all work, and I've seen them all not work very well. And again, a lot of that is going to be context specific. I think the better your soils are, the less effectiveness you will see from these biological products, because you've already got the biology in your soil. But if you're just starting out, your soil is not biologically active because it's been conventionally farmed for many years. I think that there's some good products out there that can really have some effectiveness and can really give you some good benefits. Because biology is incredibly powerful, and if you don't have it in your soil, you can't take advantage of that. Now, how can you make sure you get the right biology out there? Well, we don't have that one figured out yet. That's a really difficult one. Probably the best thing to do is to make your own compost extract. And again, it's not a hard thing to do, but it does take some time and take some effort. And there's lots of information out there on how to make Johnson Sioux compost extractors, and how you can apply that as a seed treatment, how you can put that in furrow as a biological amendment, as an additive. And if you're willing to do the work, you can definitely do this very, very inexpensively. If you're not willing to do the work and you have to buy the products, then it's going to cost you more. But again, the trade-off is you didn't have to do anything to get it done. So which ones are good ones and which ones are snake oil? I think that they all have times when they're going to work, and they're all going to have times where they don't work. But to tell you which ones are going to be the most consistently best in your operation is just going to be impossible for me to do. You're just going to have to try a number of different ones, try different ones on strip trials. And again, get together with other people and try different things and different products, and how you use and what the application rates are going to be highly product specific as to what those are as well. So that's all the questions that got submitted. But I wanted to make sure, and we got about 10 minutes here, so I wanted to make sure that we left plenty of time for interaction with people live here. Brett says, what's the best cover crop to use after soybeans at less than ideal planting dates while not using a grass species? Yeah, so the assumption would be is this is going to be coming in ahead of corn, and not wanting a grass ahead of a grass is a good idea from a agronomic standpoint. I'll put it this way first. I'm not afraid to use cereal rye ahead of corn if you have a good handle on your nutrient program and your nutrient cycling. Now, with that being said, I would not use straight cereal rye. Like those slides I was showing you from the data that we took this spring, I would go a pretty heavy shot of hairy vetch with a little bit of rye, is what I would do. Hairy vetch is going to be probably the best legume to plant late in the season. It's going to, the later you plant it, the slower it is getting going in the spring. So you got to be a little careful about, that. But again, you just have to be patient. So I would do something like, 15 pounds of vetch and 15 pounds of rye, something like that. I don't think the rye is going to take over and become a huge issue ahead of that corn crop, especially when you have 15 pounds of vetch with it. It's going to be way easier to manage than, having like 50 pounds of rye or something like that. Potentially winter peas, but they need to be planted much deeper in order to survive the winter. So I would probably lean towards the vetch. People have had some really good success with Balanza clover, even crimson clover in your area. You can get that to overwinter a lot of years. But those typically really only work the best when you get them in a little earlier. The clovers don't seem to have as much resilience to late planting as what vetch does, at least in our experience. And then another question here, what are your thoughts on a single pass herbicide program when planting soybeans into rye? Plant green, terminate rye with Roundup and residual after planting. Yeah, a lot of people do this, and like I say, this is where you'll save your money on your herbicide, is that if you have a decent amount of cereal rye biomass out there, a lot of times guys are terminating that rye with this initial burn down and then not having to come back and post, particularly if you have something with a little bit of a residual out there, and then you have the additional benefits of that biomass out there to help provide that weed suppression. I know that I've heard Rick Clark say, in order to get that weed control deep into the summer, into late July, and until that, soybeans are fully canopied and are kind of controlling weeds themselves, he really wants to see 8,000 to 9,000 pounds of dry matter biomass out there in order to do that. And if you remember from those charts that I showed, I had, so that's a little over 4 tons. I had 4 tons with my rye and vetch mix, but I didn't have it until the first week of June. And so I think that a combination of rye and vetch could work with that, but you're going to have to be patient. And the same thing here, if you want the weed control, let that rye get pretty big and then terminate it, like you're saying here, with glyphosate and some sort of residual. I don't know what residuals you guys are using out there. I wouldn't necessarily change what residual I'm using simply because I'm using a cover crop. If you've got a chemical program that's working, I would continue to use that. Just use it in conjunction with the cover crop. And the hope would be is that you don't have to come back with a follow-up pass later on. All right, what other questions you folks have? You can either type them in, you can unmute yourself and just ask them.
Keith, I had a question from a grower who couldn't be with us today, but he wanted me to ask on his behalf about if you hadn't much data on cereal rye in 15-inch rows.
Yeah, so planted in 15-inch rows. Most likely, there's 2 reasons that you would do that. I can think of 2 reasons anyway. Number one, you don't have a drill and you just have a soybean planter, so 15 inches is as narrow as you can get. The other one, and this is actually something that we've started doing more here on our own farm, and we've actually been doing it in 20-inch rows because we've got a 10-inch drill and we've been locking up half the openers and just planting in 20-inch rows instead of 10, mostly because when we are cutting with all of the drill openers, all of those all those disc openers, we cut a residue up too much, and then we tend to get windy here in the winter and early spring, and we see too much of a residue moving around. So we've started experimenting with only planting every other row, knowing that it's not going to be as good. We're not going to get the root zone completely filled with roots. We may not get full canopy, but we're willing to make some of those sacrifices in order to try to hold on to more of a residue from blowing. So that's likely not near as big an issue in wetter climates because the moisture itself kind of helps tuck your residue back in to where it doesn't move nearly as much. I don't necessarily have a lot of data on 15-inch versus 7.5 versus 10. If you're from a weed control standpoint, the narrower your rows, the better. If you're just looking at trying to promote and enhance soil biology and probably even prevent erosion, the 15-inch is probably going to be just fine. My guess is the cereal rye will fill the root zone at a 15-inch row well before it would canopy up on top. And that's really where a lot of the benefits of the cover crops are coming. So If you had the choice between 10-inch and 15-inch, I would go 10-inch. If the choice is between 15-inch and not doing it at all, I would do 15-inch rye all day long, because it's going to be way better than not doing anything.
Man, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, somebody having a question here about slugs. Are you having troubles with slugs? What to do about them? You have to have moisture to have slugs. So we've never had a slug issue. Now, you may be jealous of that, but we also only get 24, 25 inches of rain a year on an annual basis. So we're 10 to 15 inches less than you guys, and so I guess when we're dry, I'll have to keep reminding myself, at least we don't have slugs. I know though that people, in wetter environments, do deal with slugs, and I know there's slug baits you can use. There's a number of different things that people have tried. I don't have great answers for you. I know the people that have struggled with it are struggling, and they're frustrated with it and don't have a lot of great answers with that. So I don't know if anybody else on the call has had any success with dealing with slugs in a cover crop. I would be personally interested in learning that myself. And again, 15-inch rye may have less slug issues because there's going to be more air movement through there, probably to keep the surface of that soil dried out a little bit more. So that could actually help with slugs and with, keeping the surface of the soil dried out a little bit more. So again, I don't know, I'm speculating about that, but that certainly could be an advantage of having a little bit wider rows on that cover crop rye. Anything else? Anybody have any other questions?
Anyone else? That's a great idea. It sounds like some people need to test that out with the 15-inch row theory. I like that. All about testing things. Anyway, no, that the content has been fantastic. Seriously, I felt like a 1-hour school. It's been great. Thanks.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. Don't be afraid. If you have additional questions, you can get them to Renee. She can pass them on to me, or Renee, you can share my email address if people want to email me directly. I don't have a problem with that either. But thanks everybody for spending an hour with us, and I hope everybody has a very happy new year.